John Milton, who was born in 1608, was not only a classical poet, but a perfect nuisance as a politician. This was an interesting combination of values. He has been remembered as one of the greatest pamphleteers who ever annoyed government. And he succeeded so well that the country really never got over his annoyances entirely. He was a person who, I guess we would say, was star-driven. From his earliest life, it seemed as though he had been selected for a special destiny. Highly gifted, of uncertain disposition, but of tremendous intensity of dedication, he has been remembered as one of the most important literary figures in the history of Europe. This circumstance began in childhood. Milton was a poet at 15, with considerable ability and a great penetration of spirit. He attended Cambridge, and from the day he got there to the day he left, he was troublesome. In fact, he was requested to resign at one time. He left, but he came back and remained altogether nearly 7 years in higher education, which he detested. But he was sacrificing his personal feelings for a certain amount of important information. He was quite certain that the universities were educationally delinquent. They did not teach what human beings needed to know. You could graduate from the best of them in those days with very little positive accomplishment except an increasing capacity to handle local beer. This was the main record of the universities for many years, the amount of liquor that they used. The educational side seemed to have been completely overlooked. Not only were these schools famous and infamous, but they were unhealthy. The atmosphere was moldy and wet and damp. The stone walls dripped. Most of the apartments and classrooms were dark and ill-ventilated. But those were the punishments that went with higher learning in those days. It is from the university, however, at Cambridge, that Milton gained his familiarity with languages. He did not learn very much about any important scholastic subject, but he learned to use the classical languages and several of the European languages with proficiency. He also has the principal distinction, however, of being one of the few of his time in his level of thinking who chose to write in English. Now this in itself is an interesting phenomenon, because 15 or 20 years before the beginning of the 17th century, English was practically an impossible dialect. It was useless. It was very little better than the pure Chaucerian, which nobody could understand. Almost all of English at that time was local. There was idiom that dominated provinces, and when a group of soldiers had to train, being recruited from the various provinces, the orders of the day had to be given in several different languages, dialects and idioms, because otherwise nobody understood them. Yet 25 years after that, we have one of the greatest examples of English literature ever done, and that is the King James Bible. A masterpiece resulting from a tremendous upheaval in thinking and in style and in education that occurred in these few years. So Milton started out to gain a classical education, and at the same time to discover the inadequacy of the basic educational policies of his time. Realizing, however, that it was important for him to have certain contacts, he finally went back to Cambridge and stayed there for 7 years. During this time he wrote considerably in poetry, some prose, but he was mostly learning to use the tools of his craft. He had a magnificent vocabulary. He had a marvelous daring in his usage of words. And he was most of all tremendously dedicated on a religious level. Milton belonged to what might be termed in these days a dissenting clergy. He was definitely part of the, we might say, puritanical motion in England. He was Protestant in every sense of the word, and spent much of his time doing what the Protestants got their name from, protesting. He was very much of the opinion that the government of England was in very poor condition, and he had hardly graduated from Cambridge before the problems of the civil situation in the country became important to him. He realized that with King James I departed, James was a kind of not a very dangerous man. He was just kind of a simple character who was able to accomplish a fairly long rulership without causing any very great excitement, and along the way he supported and improved the condition of many scholars, including Bacon. But with his passing came Charles I, who was unhappy, unfortunate, and disliked from the beginning. Charles seemed to feel that the people existed to improve the financial condition of the rich. We have heard of such things more recently. He was convinced that taxation was simply moving that which was necessary to the people to provide the luxuries of the idle. The aristocracy in his day was an aristocracy of birth, but it took advantage of its aristocracy to pillage the public. Charles was a spendthrift. He was completely indifferent to the needs of the people. He never listened to anybody. He did exactly as he pleased and favored his own clique to the very ultimate. As this condition continued and became increasingly worse, there was undoubtedly time for a revolutionary change. And in this particular situation, Milton found his mark. He became the spokesman of the underprivileged. He became, what might be said, rather hated by the upper group, but the group up there had practically no influence in controlling the actions of the public. The public was with Milton, and as a result of that, he was comparatively safe. In the height of this situation, there loomed upon the horizon Oliver Cromwell, who became Lord Protector of England, and the first thing he did when he gained authority was to execute the king. That was the end of Charles I. Now, Cromwell was a man of iron character and also a man of tremendous personal ambitions. Cromwell was as hard as nails. He was an old soldier in manner and quality. He was a strict, square-toed Puritan in almost every way. But, of course, he had his own ideas about how a country should be run. And in spite of every effort to bring the country into a better condition, Cromwell was concerned primarily with maintaining his own position, which was not easy, because England up to that time had been for nearly 1,500 years a monarchy. In the course of time, Cromwell's influence began to wane. He became more and more dictatorial. He determined to have his own way at all costs. He created his own cronies. He developed his own proselyting propensities, and gradually the public mind turned against him. He was, however, successful in holding his position to the time of his death. He was succeeded by his son, who lasted just 1 year. he did not have his father's strength, ambitions, and dramatic ability.